Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of this year's PAM Masterclass training series. I'm Fazil. I'll be your host for the day. I'm joined by Dan, our in house product consultant, who will be taking you through this episode. In this episode, we'll be seeing how to onboard privileged users and resources onto PAM 360 and how to streamline privileged account governance. Before we actually begin the session, a couple of housekeeping rules. All attendees will be in the listen only mode by default. If you have any questions during the masterclass, please leave them in the Q&A panel and we'll get back to them at the end of the session. The session will be recorded and it'll be sent to all attendees in a couple of days. If you have any further questions to us or feedback, you can always email them to hellopam360 at manageengine.com. Dan, over to you.
On behalf of Manage Engine, I welcome you all for our first episode of PAM Masterclass series, Streamlining of Privilege Account Governance. Myself, Dan, one of the product consultants from PAM suite of solutions. Before starting the session, I'd like to give you information from the Verizon DBRI report where 74% of insider threats are due to the privilege credential abuse. Post-pandemic, it's mandatory for all organizations to use a PAM solution in their environment due to hybrid work culture. Ever-growing privileges are ever-expanding attack surfaces for any intruder. In real-time scenario, we have employees changing teams or employees leaving the organization on a daily basis, and it's very difficult for an admin to manage their privileges across multiple areas. And when it comes to user privileges, users with forever privileges on the domain level and the multiple domain privilege accounts on an environment is always a huge risk for an organization. In recent year, with the hybrid work culture, we see lots of cyber attacks all over the world and hackers trying to gain access to the organization with multiple techniques like phishing, fake websites, social engineering. And when it comes to organization privilege accounts, always careless employees are biggest threats for an organization. I believe everyone still remember the Twitter hack happened 2020, where hackers gained access to the Twitter's official admin tool, where they using which they were able to gain access to 130 celebrities profile. In this scenario where they used social engineering for gaining access to the Twitter admin panel, this gives us a pretty much example why we need to use a PAM solution on any environment. When it comes to privilege account management, organizations should have a proper track of all their privilege accounts and the activities performed using it. Let us take a look how we can implement the product on your environment, and we'll see practical use cases, how it's going to be implemented and what are the things which we can do with it. When it comes to any privilege account management solution in implementation, there is two parts. One is users and the other one is the resources. Resources are nothing but any IT assets which you have which has a username and password. It's considered as the resource on the application here. So with PAM, it creates a bridge between a user and a resource where they can securely access any assets which has been shared to them, and they can take connections to those resources from this particular tool. So first, let's take a look at user management. When it comes to user management, we need to import the users into the application first. Once they are imported, we can assign them with multiple roles. With the roles, we can completely control what they can do on the application, and we can assign a role-based access control for them. And the third part of the user management is going to be the authentication mechanism. So we can set up multiple authentication mechanism on the application here, and we can even enforce two-factor authentication for additional securities. And we can set up multiple user groups based on the team they belongs to. With this, we'll be able to pretty much control the user environment here. So let's take a look at the product, how we'll be able to do with PAM. This is the user interface of PAM here. So we log in with the admin account here. So as soon as an admin logs into the PAM application, they'll be seeing dashboard as the first view. Dashboard is nothing but a collections of data which is represented on a graphical way for easy understanding of what is happening on the environment. As soon as an admin logs into the application, he can see the total number of passwords, what it's available on the application, and what are the passwords which is expired according to the password policies and password violations. What are the passwords which is violating your password policies? All these details are given on a single screen where you don't need to go for multiple areas to generate information. All this will be given on a single screen where you can take actions accordingly. For example, if you see a couple of passwords which is expired, you can always trigger the password resets for those accounts, and you can completely manage it from here. When it comes to users, the users listed under the user tab will be allowed to log into the application and access any passwords which has been shared to them. When it comes to users adding to the application, we have multiple options. You can add it manually, or if you already have the user's information in a CSV file, we can import it from a CSV file. Or if you want to import it from your directory services, sure, we can import it from Active Directory or LDAP or Azure AD. We can go ahead and import it. Let's see how we can add a user manually into the application here. When it comes to adding a user manually into the application, you can just specify the required information like the first name, last name, and what will be the login name. You can specify it. So for example, right now I'm creating a user called Dan. Test. I'll keep the login name as Dan. And the next option is going to be the password. How we can give the password for this user. Here, when it comes to setting up a password for this particular user, you do have three options. First is generate a password, where we can generate a password for this particular user account and send it to their email address, which is associated with them. Or you can use the same username as the password for the first time, or even you can manually specify a password. So once the user logs in with any of these passwords which has been shared to him, he'll be able to log into the application and change his password for the first time login. So this is just a one-time password which we are generating for the users from this particular place. And when it comes to access level, we have multiple roles on the application, which is administrator, privileged administrator, password administrator, or going to be the administrator role on the application here. And connection user, password auditor, password user will be the end user roles on the tool. Based on our requirements, we can assign the roles to the user. So currently I'm adding it as a password user. And the next is going to be the access scope, where you can select either the passwords owned and shared or all my passwords. All my passwords option can be given only to an administrator. If you give any administrator users on the application with all my passwords option on the application, the user becomes the super user, where he'll be able to see all the passwords which is added on the application here. But right now, it as a password user, so I'm changing the access level. So right now, this user will be able to just see the password which has been shared to him. And when we are adding it, we can select. either this particular user needs two-factor authentication or not, we can enable it or disable it based on our requirements. And if this user belongs to any specific department or location, you can enter that particular information. And further, you can just say this particular user needs mobile access. So where we do have mobile apps for PAM 360. So whether the user can log into the PAM 360 mobile app, we can enable or disable it from here. And also extension is available for it. So you can enable or disable the extension access from here. Once you enter all the required information, you can click on Save, where this particular user will be created on the application. And when the user log into the application, he'll use the local authentication to log into the application. This is how we add a user manually. Or if you have the user information in a CSV file where you don't want to add users manually one by one, you can always import the CSV file into the application, or even if you have it in a text file, you can just import the text file into the application here. For importing the users from a text file, you can just go ahead and select. You can select the CSV file. Once the file is selected, you'll be prompted to select the fields which you have it on the CSV file here. So you can map the fields here one by one. Once you select the fields, you can just click on Finish. This will allow you to import the users from the CSV file into the application here. The other option is where we can, if you don't want to add users manually, or if you don't want to import it from a CSV file, then we do have options where you can directly integrate with your Active Directory and import the users into the application here. So for integrating with your Active Directory, you can just select the domain name. So since we have already information populated, we have the details here. If it's a first time, you can just click on add domain, add new domain, and you can enter your NetBIOS name of the domain. Once it's done, you can just click on add. This will add your domain name over here. Once it's done, you can just enter your domain controller, primary and the secondary domain controller information. And for the connection method, you can either use SSL or non-SSL. In case of if you are using an SSL connection, then you have to import the domain controller certificate into the application, using which PAM will connect to the Active Directory and import the users. And here you can enter the username and password which PAM will use to connect to your Active Directory and read the user accounts from your domain. So the account what we specify here should have a read access on your Active Directory. Or even if you already have the information stored inside the application, you can select the second option and you can select the account which you want to use it for this connection. Right now, I already have the details stored. So I'm selecting the option to use the account stored in PMP. And I'm selecting the resource name and the account which will be used for connection. And in case, if you want to just import a single user from the domain, you can just enter the username and you can get it imported. Or even if you want to import a couple of users, you can just enter their usernames in a comma separated format and we can import it. Or even if you want to import a specific group or OU, you can just enter the group name or the OU and you can get it imported. And you can enable the sync interval for it. So any new users added to the group or OU which is imported into the application, if a new user is added to that group, PAM will automatically add the users during the sync interval where you don't need to do the import multiple times. In case if you don't want to specify any information over here like username or group name or OU name manually, you can always click on fetch groups and OUs. This will go ahead and enumerate the complete AD tree structure for you. So this will go ahead and bring the Active Directory groups and OUs for you. And you can select the required groups or OUs and you can import it. If you already have a specific groups which you want to import it, you can just select the group name or OU and you can get it imported here. So for example, right now I want to import this PAM OU, and under that PAM OU, I have multiple sub OUs. If I want to import all these, I can just select the PAM OU and you can get all the users from this particular OU imported into the application here. And the next option is importing it from Azure, where for Azure, you need to enter the domain name similar to the Active Directory. You need to enter the domain name. And here for the Azure connection, we use enterprise application where you need to create an enterprise application on your Azure environment, and using that application will connect to your Azure AD and import the users here. So for importing the users from Azure, you need to enter the client ID of the application which you have created on the Azure. And here you can have two authentication mechanism, either user-based authentication mechanism or app-based authentication mechanism here. If it's a user-based authentication mechanism, you can just enter the username and its password, and you can get the users imported from your Azure AD. Or if you want to use the app only auth token, you can just give the application tenant ID and client secret for it, and you can get the users imported from Azure. Similar to Active Directory, if you want to just import a single user, you can just enter the username and you can get it imported. Or if you want to import a group, you can just enter the group name and you can get it imported. And you can enable the sync interval. So any new user added to the group will be automatically added to the sync. And in case if you don't want to enter any information manually, you can always click on Fetch Groups and OUs. This will enumerate the structure. And you can select any specific groups which you want to import and add it to the application here. And the other option what we have for importing users is importing it from LDAP. So in places where you install the PAM application on a Linux environment, in that case, you'll not be able to directly use the Active Directory option to import the users. In that case, you can just use the LDAP option to import the users to the application here. Or even if you use a third-party Active Directories, sure, you can use the LDAP options and import the users here. For importing it from LDAP, you need to enter the primary domain controller information and the secondary domain controller information. And you need to specify what kind of connection you want to use, either SSL or non-SSL. If it's going to be a SSL connection, then you have to import your domain controller certificate into the application here. And here you can enter the user account, which will be used for connecting to your Active Directory, and import the users here. And you can create the base DN and search filters according to your requirements, where you want to import it from a specific group or OU. You can create the filters according to your requirements here. So I have already have the informations added here. So just give me a minute. Let me show that up. So here, this is going to be the primary domain controller information and what port which we are going to use. If it's going to be non-SSL, it's going to be 389. Or if it's going to be a SSL connection which you want to use, then it's going to be 636. And here you can specify the base DN and the search filter according to the groups which you want to import it here. Once you specify the information, you can click on import and save. This will import the users from LDAP. And other than importing the users from the directory services and importing it manually, we do have a other option where if you want to get any credentials from a remote machine using an API call, we do have a user where you can add it, API user, using which you can retrieve credentials or create credentials on the application here. For adding an API user, you need to specify the name and the host from where you're going to do the API calls from, and you can enter the full name for it and the email address and the access level, what type of role you want to assign it to this user. And when it comes to API, we support two different API options on the application here. One is SSH CLI and the other one is the REST API. If it's going to be a SSH CLI, then you have to import the public key of SSH public key for the user here. Or if it's going to be a REST API, you can generate the auth token. Based on the auth token, it gets authenticated to the application here and retrieve the credentials or allow you to add credentials using the API here. So these are the methods what we have for importing the users into the application. And when it comes to roles, the application comes with 6 different roles as we discussed earlier. The first 3 roles in the list will be the administrator roles, which is the privilege administrator and password administrator, or the admin roles on the application, where privilege admin is going to be the most highest role on the application, who can perform any activities on the application like managing users, managing passwords, and viewing reports and managing the security controls of the product and configuring remote apps and file transfer configuration. All these can be configured with the privilege admin role. The only difference between the admin and the privilege admin is going to be the managing of privacy and the security control of the product. Only the privilege admin will be able to do that. Other than that, admin and privilege admin pretty much can do any work on the application here. And password administrator is going to be one of the other admin roles what we have in the application here. The, as the name says, this particular user will be able to do any operations related to the passwords on the application here. So he'll not be able to manage users, or he'll not be able to manage the privacy and the security control of the product, and he'll not be able to view the reports. He'll be able to do any operations related to resource management, which is like adding resources and sharing the resources with the other users, and he can view the passwords on the application here. So the first 3 roles will be the admin, and the next 3 roles on the list is going to be the password user roles, that is the end user roles on the application here, which is password auditor, password user, and connection users. When it comes to password auditor, you can assign this particular role for any auditors in your organization, or even a third-party auditor is coming to your organization. You can assign them with this particular role, where with this particular role, the user will be able to just view the password which has been shared to him, and he can just view the audits and the reports which is available on the application, using which he can do the complete auditing work and log out of the system. And password user is going to be the most end role on the application, who can just view the passwords which has been shared with him, and he can take connections to the devices based on the resource types which we have shared. Either it's going to be an RDP or SSH or SQL connection. He can launch it from here. And connection user is going to be a slight higher role on the than the password user here, where he'll be able to view the resources which has been shared to him, and he can take connections to those resources. Other than that, he'll be able to launch a remote app to a device, and he'll be able to transfer files between the servers. So connection user will have the additional privilege over here on the password user side. And by default, when a users are added to the application, they'll be added with the role called password users, and we can change the role according to our requirements and control their complete access on the application here. In case if these default roles on the application is not uh, if you're thinking like you want to customize the role and you want to change what are the permissions that can be taken by this particular user. For example, on IT team, they can add any resources. They don't need to delete anything, or you don't want them to create any resources like that. You can create roles on the application here. So you can enter your based on your requirement. You can create roles. So you can create a role according to your requirements, and you can select what operation this user role can perform on the application here. For example, I want the user to do same like password user, but I want him to generate reports. I can select what reports this user can do, generate, and I can create it as a new role. Once I click on preview and save, I can see what are the operations this user can perform. And if I think this should be sufficient, or if I need to add any other permissions, I can just go and click on cancel, and I can add additional options to the user here. Once the user is assigned with this particular role, they'll be able to pretty much do the operations which we define. So you can pretty much customize the role according to your requirements on the application here. And when it comes to authentication, we support multiple first factor authentications on the application like Active Directory, Azure AD, LDAP, SAML, Radius, and SmartCard will be the first factor of authentication, which can be configured with the application, where you can just go to the any first factor authentication which you want to enable, and you can just click on enable. That will allow you to log into the application using the Active Directory or LDAP credentials or Azure credentials. You can just log into the application, where the authentication is going to be a live authentication. So as soon as the user enters the username and password, it will try to connect to the Active Directory and verify the information. If it's verified, it will allow the user to get access to the application here. And in case if you want to increase the security of the product, since all the privilege accounts are stored inside the application, user needs to have a two-factor authentication configured. Sure, you can configure two-factor authentication on the application, where you can configure any one of these as a second factor of authentication. So once the users are successfully logged into the application with the first factor of authentication using either Azure AD or LDAP or SAML, they'll be prompted for a second factor authentication. So you can configure any one of these methods. Right now, I have configured Google Authenticator as the second factor of authentication mechanism on my application now. So the users will be prompted for a Google Authenticator code, where they have to enter it. Once it's successful, it will allow the user to log into the application and retrieve any passwords which has been shared to them. With this, we'll come to the end of the user management. Let's see the next topic. Before we go to the next topic, I just want to have a quick poll to understand how the service accounts being managed on your environment. Do you have a track of the service accounts, on which server the service accounts are being used? Do you have a track of it? So you can answer the question in the poll. You can just enter the details on the question and answer session. The next is going to be the resource management topic. When it comes to resource management, any username or password what you have in the environment will be considered as a resource on the application here. You can store it and share it to the required users, and they'll get access, and you'll have a pretty much control of what they're doing in the application. On the resource management, first we have to onboard all the resources into the application. Once it's onboarded, we can schedule the resource discovery, and then we can group the resources together according to our requirements and do any bulk operations. And we can share it to a multiple user for accessing it. Let's see how we import resources into the application. When it comes to importing resources into the application, we have multiple options here. You can add it manually or import it from a file, or if you're having information in the KeePass database, sure, you can just get the KeePass database imported and get all the details into the application in a single shot. For adding it manually, you need to specify the resource information one by one, like what is the resource name, and when it comes to adding resources, you do have multiple options to select from. We out of the box, we support 83 devices. These are the resource types that is supported by default with the application. And in case if you have any other resource types, you can add it. You can add it to the application, and then you can going forward, you can manage it further from here. So right now I'm adding a Windows server here. I can say what is the server name, IP address, and what type of device it is. And if it belongs to a domain, you can just enter the domain name. And you can click on save and proceed. Here you can enter the local account username and password. And you can click on save. This will allow you to add the resource manually into the application here. Or if you already have the resource information in a CSV file, you can just click on import from file, and you can select the CSV file from the list, and you can map the fields and click on finish. Once you map the fields, you can just click on finish. That will allow you to import the resources from the CSV file. And if you have your passwords currently on a KeePass database, you can just click on import from KeePass and select the KeePass database KDBX file and enter its password and click on import. This will allow you to import it from the KeePass database into the application. And in case if you don't have a proper track of all your assets and its local accounts and the accounts which is being used on your environment, we do have a discovery function where you can go and discover the devices from your environment and add it to the application here. And when it comes to discovery, we support 5 different discovery options on the application: Windows, Linux, network device, VMware, and AWS will be the discovery methods which is supported with the application now. So when it comes to Windows discovery, it's similar to the Active Directory import, where you'll be specifying the domain name and the domain controller, and select the user account and its password. The account what we select here will be used for connecting to your Active Directory and fetching the domain member service. When it comes to entering any account on this particular location, the account what we specify here should have domain admin rights or local admin rights on all your member servers so that we can go and pull up all the member server into the application along with the local accounts and service accounts. During the Windows discovery process, PAM will connect to the Active Directory and it will go to the group or the OU which you have selected, and it will list down all the member servers which you have it on the group or OU first. So once the member servers are listed, it will try to connect to each and every member service which is discovered, and it will try to find the local accounts available on those boxes. Once the local account discovery is completed, it will try to check for any domain account which is being used on those machines for running any services. And if any service domain account is used for running services on the endpoint, it will be added into the application here. So here also you can just enter a single server name and you can get it imported, or if you can enter the group name or OU name and you can get it imported. And here also you can specify the sync interval. So any new resources which added to a group or OU can be automatically added to the application and shared to the users, where you don't need to do the import multiple times. Everything will be added during the sync interval here. So you can click on fetch groups and OUs and it will enumerate the structure. In case if you don't want to enter any group name or OU names manually, you can always click on fetch groups and OUs and you can select it from the required groups or OUs from the list. So once the device are discovered, all the domain member servers will be added under the resource type called Windows, and you can just click on the resource name. That will tell you what are the local accounts you have on those boxes, and any domain account which is being used for running services will be added under the resource type called Windows domain. And if you want to know on which box, which service it's running, you can just click on the computer icon next to the account name. That will display on which box, what is the service it's currently running. If the same account is used on multiple boxes, you will be seeing the information like this. And you can, once it's imported, you can manage the credentials from here, where you can reset the credentials and you can update it on the endpoints where it's running the services. Everything can be possibly achieved from here. So this is about the Windows discovery part. And when it comes to Linux network devices and VMware, these three are going to be more or like a similar discovery functions. Only the connection methods is going to be different for each and every discovery process here. When it comes to Linux, we'll discover the devices based on the host name. You can just enter the host name in a comma separated format and we can import it. Or if you want to import it from in an IP range, you can just enter the IP range and we can get it discovered here. Or if you have the IP address and host information in a file, sure, you can select that particular file and you can get it imported here. Right now, I'm just going to import a specific server. And when it comes to Linux import, we have two different connection methods. One is SSH and the other one is Telnet. When you're selecting Telnet, we'll just discover the devices, we'll not discover the accounts, local accounts on the Linux boxes. with the SSH discovery, we'll be able to discover the local accounts on that endpoints and get it added into the application. For the SSH discovery, SSH based Linux discovery, you need to add a profile. When you're adding the profile, you need to specify these details for the connection. And based on this connection, PAM will try to connect to the device and fetch for the local accounts you have on the Linux boxes and get it added over here. So here you need to enter the port. What is the Linux port which you want, SSH port which you want to connect? And here you can enter the user prompt and you can enter the account name. And if you want to do the local account discovery, you can just enable this particular option. When you're enabling it, it will allow you to elevate your privileges. If the same test account has the sudo permissions on the box, I can just say use sudo and I can go and import the devices here. Or if the test account doesn't have a sudo rights, I can just go and say su switch user and change it to a root user, or any user account which has a root privileges on the endpoint, and I can do the discovery. Right now, with the test account, I have the sudo permissions. I'll just say like use sudo and I'll create the profile. Once the profile is created, you can select the profile which you want to use it for this discovery, and you can click on discover. This will allow you to discover the device from the network. Once the discovery task is completed, we'll be able to see the status and we can go and discover it from here, add it to the application from here. And even if you want to have a schedule for the Linux discovery, you can specify an IP range and you can create the schedule for it. So any new Linux devices which is getting added in between this particular IP range gets automatically added to the application. So you don't need to do the import multiple times, similar to the other options what we have. Once the devices are added, the Linux devices are discovered, it will be added to the application here. And you can just click on the resource name that will display the local accounts what you have on that particular machine over here. So the next is going to be the network device discovery. So with the network device discovery, we'll be able to discover all the network devices which you have it on your network and add it to the application here. And when it comes to network device discovery, we use SNMP based discovery option. So we support 3 different SNMP profiles, and based on it, we'll try to connect to the devices and discover the assets and add it to the application here. Here also you can specify an IP range, or even if you know the host name or the IP address, you can enter it, or even if you have the details in a file, you can select it from the file and you can get it imported. And when it comes to VMware, we use VMware vSphere API to connect to the devices and do the discovery part. Similar to the Linux and network device discovery, you can either specify an IP range, or if you know the host name, you can just enter the host name or the IP address in a command separated format, or even if you have the information in a file, you can select the file and you can import it. And here for connecting, you need to create a profile, and you can create the profile which will be used during the discovery process. And with the VMware discovery, we'll be able to discover all the ESXi host on your environment and add it to the application here without any issues. So all the other options which we saw earlier will allow you to add the devices which is on your network. In case if you have any devices which is on AWS, which you like to get it imported into the application and manage it further from here, sure, that is very much possible, where you can create a task and you can select the region where the device belongs to, and you can specify the access key. You can enter the access key and the secret key here. In case if the information is already stored inside the application, you can select it from here. And here, using this particular credentials, we'll be able to connect to the AWS environment and we can discover it. And you need to create a profile, which you'll be specifying the profile name and the SSH private key, using which and the username, easy to username, using which we'll be able to connect to the endpoints and discover the accounts and add it to the application here. So all your IT assets can be either added manually or imported from a file, or using the discovery method, we can add it. Once the devices are added, all the devices which is discovered or imported from a file will be available under the resource tab. You can go and share it to the required users. And when it comes to PAM, it works on a concept of ownership and sharing. So if an admin adds a resource, it will be visible for that particular user unless or until it's shared to the other users or to the other admins on the application here. So once the devices are added, we'll be sharing it to the users. When it comes to sharing, you can share the resources to the users in multiple ways. Either you can share the complete resource to the user, or if you want to just share a specific account on the resource, we can share a specific account to the user. Or in case if you want to share it in a bulk, for example, where you want to share all the IT team passwords in a single shot, we can group the resources and share it to a user. So if you want to share all the accounts under a resource to a user or to a user group, you can just click on resource action and share with user or to a user group, and you can share the resources to the user. When it comes to sharing, you can share the resources to the users in multiple permission levels. One is view permission, the other one is modify and full access. When you're giving view permission to the resources, the users will be able to just view the passwords which has been shared with them, and they can just take RDP or SSH connection based on the device which we are sharing. And when you are sharing it with the modify permission, the user will be able to change that particular password from the application here. And full access, this can be given to administrator roles on the application. So the users who has admin roles on the application can get the full access permission here. When you're sharing the resources to any users with full access permission, they become a co-owner for the resources, where they'll be able to manage the same resources from the application here. And by doing the resource level sharing, all these accounts under the resource get shared to the user. In case if you don't want to share all these 4 accounts to the user, you just want to share the test one account to the users, then you do have account level sharing, where you can just go to the account, click on share to user, and you can select the required user and share it to the user based on the required permissions. Either it's going to be view or modify. In case if you want to do any bulk operations, like if you want to share uh, hundreds of passwords to a user or to a user group, you do have an option where you can create groups on the application and share it to the user. And moreover, when you're importing the resources from Active Directory, if you're importing a group or OU, the same group will be created on the application, and you can just click on the group name, which you see over here. It will display whatever accounts which you have it on that specific OU. For example, uh, you have offices in multiple locations, and all office resources are added to a specific group. For example, group A contains resources from US, group B contains resources from London. If you are importing the same group from the Active Directory, here it will create a local group and add all the resources from that particular group to this particular resource group available on the application. And if a new resource is added to the group, and it will sync it here, and this resource can be shared to a user or to a user group. So any resources which they need access, it will be automatically shared. And when it comes to grouping, you do have an option where you can create groups locally on the application and share it to the users. And grouping can be done at two different options. One is static, and the other one is dynamic. When it comes to static, you can select the resources which you want to add it to the group. You can select the devices which needs to be added to this group and add it to the application here. Once the devices are added to the group, you can share this to a user or to a user group. So the user belongs, once any resources belongs to this group, will be shared to the user or to a user in a bulk, where you don't need to do the sharing multiple times. In a single click, you'll be able to share the devices to the users from the application here. The other grouping option what we have in the application is the dynamic group. Here, with the dynamic group, you can specify a criteria. Based on the criteria, the resource gets added to the application, and you can share it to a user or to a user group. For example, you want to group all the local admin accounts on your Windows machines. You can just say like user account contains admin search. Right now, we are getting all the accounts which user account which has admin on the name. If I want to just filter just the Windows devices which has admin accounts, I can just say add an other criteria, says user resource type equals Windows. So the Windows device which contains admin gets added, or even if I want to further get only the resources which has administrator accounts, only should be added to this group. In that case, I can just say user account equals administrator. So only the resource which contains administrator as a local account gets added here. Once it's grouped, I can share this particular group to a user or to a user group, or I can schedule the password reset for this group. So if you want to rotate all the local admin account passwords every 30 days once, or 90 days once, based on your password requirements, you can do using this particular option. With that, we are coming to the end of the session. We'll see a recap of what we saw on this particular session. It's going to be discovering of all your assets and storing it into the application and defining the users and user roles on the application, enforcing a strict password policy, and sharing the resources to the users based on the requirements, and mandating two-factor authentication. This is a quick overcap of what we saw on the session. And if you have any questions, please post your questions on the question and answer session area.
Dan, we have a couple of questions here. Um, are you able to disable user roles from having access to use personal passwords?
Sure, you can go ahead and disable the personal password area for a specific users, or you can do it globally. So you can globally disable the personal passwords, or even if you want to disable it for a specific uh, user groups, we can do it. So for specific group of users also, if you want to disable it, we can do it.
Right. Another question, are we using API to fetch VM resources?
Yes, we use vSphere API for fetching the devices from on the VMware.
Right. If you have any further questions, please drop them here. We'll wait a couple of minutes. You can always, of course, email your questions to hello-pam360@manageengine.com. All right, if there are no further questions, thank you everyone for attending the first episode of this year's PAM Masterclass training series. Our next episode will be on remote password resets, right? That'll be on March 23rd. So do watch out for the emails for the same, and you can register for that episode as well when registration is open. Thank you so much for attending this episode. I hope this was informational for all of you. And we hope to see you back for the second episode next month. Right, Dan, anything else to add?
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining, and
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.